So now we want to look at the responses. We're going to look at the response of Zacharias to the news of his son, John the Baptist. We're going to look at the response of Gabriel, and we're going to look at the response of Elizabeth as well. All of this is in verses 18 through 25 of Luke chapter 1. So we had broken up our text, which is Luke 1, 5 through 25, into these three parts, right? The introduction, the announcement, and now we have come to verses 18 through 25, which are the responses. So remember, what happens here is that Zacharias doubts Gabriel's message, and Gabriel takes away Zacharias' speech until the child is born. And then we see Elizabeth's response. So Zacharias' response is he doubts. Gabriel's response is that he takes away Zacharias' speech. But then Elizabeth's response is that she hides away for 5 months after this news, but also rejoices greatly that her barrenness will no longer cause her shame in her community. So let's look at these verses together. So we left off last time with this part 2, with the announcement that the Son is going to turn the hearts of the fathers back to the children. And so now, after quoting the end of Malachi, let's continue on and what happens in this account with Zacharias and the angel. Verse 18. So Zacharias said to the angel, "How shall I know this for certain? For I am an old man, and my wife is advanced in years." The angel answered him and said, "I am Gabriel, who stands in the presence of God, and I have been sent to speak to you and to bring you this good news. Behold, you shall be silent and unable to speak until the day these things take place, because you did not believe my words, which shall be fulfilled in their proper time." And the people were waiting for Zacharias and were wondering at his delay in the temple. When he came out, he was unable to speak to them, and they realized that he had seen a vision in the temple. And he kept making signs to them, and he remained mute. And it came about when the days of his priestly service were ended that he went back home. After these days, Elizabeth, his wife, became pregnant. And she kept herself in seclusion for 5 months, saying, "This is the way the Lord has dealt with me in the days when he looked with favor upon me to take away my disgrace among men." So again, a lot happens in these verses. Let's go back and review them. So verses 21 and 22. Remember, Zacharias is in the temple. Outside, people don't know what's going on because normally this doesn't take very long, and he is delaying. So they're wondering what's going on with Zacharias. Now, if we remember that the altar of incense itself, remember the location was right up near the curtain that divided the holy place from the Holy of Holies. And there's a couple good quotes that relate to this moment that I think are helpful for our understanding. The first one comes from the Zondervan International Bible Backgrounds Commentary, and it says, "Though Zacharias did not enter the most holy place, or the Holy of Holies, the altar of incense," that's right where he was, "just outside in the holy place stood very close to the Ark of the Covenant, which was inside the Holy of Holies, and therefore, hence, to the awesome power and presence of God." So location-wise, where Zacharias was in the holy place, giving the altar of incense, working on the altar of incense, was super close geographically to right behind the curtain, which was the Ark of the Covenant in the Holy of Holies. And there's a quote from the Mishnah, which is Jewish writings, that describes how the high priest on the day of Yom Kippur would make the offering inside the Holy of Holies. So this is from the Mishnah. It says, "When the high priest reached the ark, he put the fire pan between the two bars. He heaped up the incense on the coals, and the whole place became filled with smoke. He came out by the way he went in, and in the outer space he prayed a short prayer. But he did not prolong his prayer, lest he put Israel in terror." So this is describing the Ark of the Covenant, which this right here, the Ark of Incense, was right immediately behind, and that's what Zacharias was doing. And so here, when we read verse 21, the people were waiting for Zacharias. The incense offering did not take very long, so they're wondering why he was delaying, and he comes out, and he's mute, and he can't talk, and they realize that something significant had happened. So here in verse 23, it says, when he came home, right, the days of his priestly service were ended, and he went back home. So what a moment that must have been for Zacharias, having to not be able to tell his wife what happened, but yet in the meantime, God fulfills his promise. She becomes pregnant, and then she secludes herself for 5 months. You can see that right there. She became pregnant, and she kept herself in seclusion, which is an interesting little detail, especially because this was such good news to her. The Lord had taken away her disgrace. And again, another quote that I thought was helpful here says, there is no known Israelite custom that required such seclusion. This may have been a spiritual retreat for a grateful prayer of what God had done, or perhaps it was Elizabeth's way of respecting God's silence imposed on Zacharias. So we don't know, but it does talk about Elizabeth's godly response in all of what we see of her and what we're going to see of her coming up. So again, those are the three parts of Luke 1, 5 through 25. We have the introduction where we meet Zacharias and Elizabeth, two godly people with a priestly lineage. They get the announcement that they are going to have a son while Zacharias is serving in a potentially once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to offer incense in the temple in Jerusalem to the Lord. And then we see the responses both of Zacharias and Elizabeth, but also of Gabriel. Zacharias doubts Gabriel because of he and Elizabeth's age. In response, Gabriel takes away his speech until the child is born. And then in response to this, Elizabeth, who becomes pregnant miraculously, hides away in seclusion for 5 months, all the while so greatly rejoicing that God has removed her barrenness that has caused her social shame and now has offered her an answer to her prayers about having a child that they've been wanting for many, many years. So that's an overview of Luke 1, verses 5 through 25, John's birth now foretold to Zechariah. So we're going to continue forward in our next module. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at these sections here. Jesus' birth foretold to Mary, Mary's visit to Elizabeth, and Mary's song of joy. Because we said earlier that this whole event with Zacharias and the announcement of John the Baptist is now set up to parallel a similar event that is going to happen with Mary. And we're going to cover that in Module 6. So in Module 6, what we want to do is we want to now look at the account where Mary receives the news of Jesus' birth. So these are the next three parts. Luke 1, verses 26 through 38, which is Jesus' birth foretold to Mary, followed by Luke 1, verses 39 to 45, Mary's visit to Elizabeth, and then finally Luke 1, 46 through 56, Mary's song of joy. So we're going to stay in the Gospel of Luke, and we're now going to really see the account of Mary receiving the news, and now in contrast to the news given to Zacharias and Elizabeth. So join me in Module 6 as we look at Mary receives the news of Jesus' birth.